so much for those talks. Really, really interesting. Are there any questions in the room first? I've got a couple online.
Thank you for all the talks. Really, really good all day, actually. And this is a question for Runa from Denmark. In my previous life, I was an animal welfare scientist and I worked with pigs, so I visited Denmark quite a lot and then joined the animal protection movement before moving over to food. But when I visited Denmark in 2017, 2018, farmers were already, that I spoke to, talking about reduction and dietary change. So I was just wondering when you started working on this and when things started to happen to get those farmers more activated to take action in this area.
Oh, good question. Thank you for that one. So I would say, there's this FAO report called Livestock's Long Shadow, which came in 2006. That was the first time someone mainstream said something about the burden on the planet. Before, it was really fringe veggie NGOs and some very small green NGOs. Greenpeace didn't even touch the subject, I think, at that time. So after the FAO had the Livestock's Long Shadow in 2006, then it took kind of 10 years until it became a mainstream part of the debate in Denmark, and probably a couple more years in other countries. So even in Denmark, there's been a huge delay. I would still say you might have talked to a few farmers who were open at that time, but I think, in my view, they were still mostly skeptical and trying to fight off that change. But it's true, like Arla and Danish Crown, these two giants. Arla is merging with a German company to become Europe's largest dairy company. Danish Crown is Europe's largest pork exporter. So they're big. And their initial reaction 6-7 years ago was that, well, there's also a market here. Let's also move into that market. Since then, since the global markets for meat imitations on Oatly's failure, you can say, to capture the entire world, that their stock value dropped, then maybe Arla and Danish Crown have become a bit more hesitant, but they are not against it. They're still open. It seems to me like within the Danish Farmers Association and among Danish farmers, they're diverse. Probably the same goes in the UK. But in Denmark, they're somehow managing to find an equilibrium between the skeptics who are saying, fuck off, we'll produce whatever we want to do, stay off my plate, and those farmers who will say, yeah, I'm also eating less meat myself, and those saying, let me explore cultivating some legumes. So there's somehow a slightly more healthy equilibrium between the different fractions or factions of the farmers in Denmark, maybe. And I do want to applaud them for that. That said, Denmark is still a hugely livestock-intensive country. But there is a certain attitude here that they're still seeing themselves as farmers and they're interested in business opportunities. And if you talk nicely to them and actually seek out a real dialogue, they are open to that conversation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris. So in 1980, I had my first week at medical school, and a professor of epidemiology told us that the food industry was poisoning us and that no government had ever dared take that food industry on. And 45 years later, we find ourselves in the same situation. So I guess my question is, how do we break the tessellation where a government won't act to legislate on a food industry and help people make the right decisions, when a business won't change because the government won't legislate and the people won't buy it, and the people won't change because the industries won't change and the government won't regulate, when presumably the Daily Mail are all scared off with the nanny state argument, the politicians run frightened, and there's pork barrelling going on. So how do we break this when we're facing a media and financial industry that's been unbreakable for 45 years?
I feel like this was probably aimed at me. Full disclosure, Hugh is an old friend in all senses. So we can look at, I think there are two kind of sources of hope here. First of all, you look at South and Central America, and in very slightly different cultural contexts, they have brought in a 360-degree set of policies where they use progressive taxation, warning labels, marketing restrictions, and public health guidance to start to really shift people away from an ultra-processed dietary pattern back to not entirely away from it. No one's saying ban it, but they start to shift diets. So that is happening. In the United States, what's happening is, I think, there is growing population support, and the FFCC have pointed that out here, so that politicians are getting a mandate, but the state's attorneys and private lawsuits are bringing strategic litigation. And so I think there's definitely room for non-financial collaboration between advocates and industry, and that must happen. But there is at some point, I think, with particularly around ultra-processed food, the first private lawsuit has already begun, and states attorneys are very interested in this area. And that is the only thing that worked with tobacco. Industry was dragged kicking and screaming to court, fined billions of dollars, and that created the master settlement. And a big part of that litigation was going, the companies are lying. They are deceiving you in portion size, in marketing, in nutritional claims, in their lobbying, in everything they do. So I'm optimistic, but lots of people in this room will remember or will know we proved tobacco using epidemiological evidence caused lung cancer in 1955. I think it was Dolan Peto and the BMJ, and effective regulation didn't come in until probably after 2000. It started in the mid-90s, so it took 40 years. But that's the template, in my view.
Thank you very much. And of course, they exported that to the global south. So, yeah, and there's similarities there.
Thanks, Rami. Hugh makes a very good point. But it's interesting that you qualified in 1980, because that was the year that the world economy switched from a kind of New Deal approach to neoliberalism, to government bad, markets good. And the question is, are we reaching a tipping point there? And so there are two comments on that. Firstly, neoliberal economics has led to a massive increase in inequalities, which are now firstly expressing ridiculously in the MAGA movement, but which may turn round and may actually hit back. And, you know, the obscene rise in billionaires and oligarchs and the like. But the second point is one that Chris has just touched on in his answer. We need nasty lawyers, don't we? I mean, basically, for climate change, for food, for everything like this, we need lawyers who hit companies' bottom line with class action suits, with whatever they can do, and getting, you know, obese children who are parents, you know, prosecuting companies for whatever they're doing. And I think that's the only way that we're really going to get change in these systems.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I just to mention, yeah, I mean, obviously a really big area, but often outgunned in terms of the investments, and I think Chris could probably talk to that more. Any other questions in the audience? Yeah, unless you want.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. So I want to turn the topic now to the nutrient inadequacy. We've seen plenty of evidence throughout the day today of current diets being grossly inadequate, but actually also people simply not eating healthily. So in the UK alone, you know, UPF intakes, of course, nutrient poverty of those diets. We saw 5% of people are meeting fiber, 4% are meeting the fiber, 5%, 10% meeting fruit and vegetable, etc. Thresholds. So it's already there, and it's worse in the global south because people are living on poverty diets. So the shift towards plant forward overall is likely to benefit for most nutrients. And we saw also earlier today some data, I also spoke about it and others did, on some of the nutrients like fiber intake, vitamin C levels, folate levels going up, saturated fat going down. Where there is cause for concern is specific populations in specific geographies, particularly, and subpopulations for some micronutrients. And you beautifully showed the strategies that can address them. So I'd like to discuss with the panel what the win-wins and lose-lose options are, or the combinations thereof, of weighing up the obesity and chronic disease and more early death risk versus nutrient inadequacy and how that could be dealt with?
That's a massive question. So I'm gonna start talking about it, but obviously very happy to then hear from other panelists and someone else also in the public. For me, when I look at those 4 solutions, I believe that each of these have pros and cons. Some of them are stronger in the perspective of, for example, reducing non-communicable disease risk. Others are stronger in the perspective of filling up the nutrient gaps. Some have gaps that have to do with compliance and with reliability in certain contexts. Some have gaps that have to do with affordability. I can go through all of them, but what I really believe in is that we need a little bit of all 4. What we need is definitely a shift in diets, because as I showed, there's countries that are massively over-consuming animal source foods in the globe, and I only showed 3 cases of some of the most populous countries globally, but there's many others that are massively over-consuming animal source foods. I see that in France and Switzerland, where I currently live, in Italy, where I am originally from. But then there's actually countries where instead nutrient deficiencies may outweigh the weight, the burden of non-communicable diseases still. And there are specific population groups, as you mentioned, where the burden of anemia, the burden of folate deficiency, of vitamin A deficiency may actually outweigh the pros of introducing primarily plant-forward diets. So I think it's very much a matter of looking at the specific context where we work. And if we're talking about a context like the UK or Denmark or any other country in the global north, I fully agree with you. When we're looking at the global south, I really think that we need the 4 solutions. And we cannot go and propose plant-based diets like that as a blanket approach, because there may be unintended consequences. Fortification can definitely be a successful and evidence-based response to filling those nutrient gaps. But there's problems even there, as we were discussing this morning. For example, at GAIN, we conducted a large study that tries to assess how compliant industries in the global south are in countries like India, where fortification is a big thing, Kenya, where there's mandatory fortification standards for some products. And what we found is that in reality, most millers, most oil producers do not fortify their products and do not comply with national fortification standards. So even if there's a law that says that vegetable oil needs to be fortified in vitamin E and vitamin A and whatever else, in reality that's not happening on the ground. So people are not getting the nutrients that they need from fortification. So fortification is useful, it is evidence-based, it is not expensive, it is environmentally friendly, but there's problems with compliance and with reliability of these products and what actually gets into the houses of people. Supplementation, same thing. Many supplements, especially in some countries, actually do not comply to the dietary guidelines for making supplements. And this is a problem with the industry compliance. It's a problem with incentives, with subsidies, etc. So supplementation can be a part of the solution, but it cannot be the whole solution. And biofortification, another solution which is gaining ground recently, and especially in some countries, we also have projects on biofortification in Kenya, in Uganda, in Rwanda, at GAIN. We strongly believe in biofortification, but unfortunately so far it's only been adopted on a very small scale. And it's very, very hard to expand the scale of biofortification projects, because then there's companies that want to sell their seeds. I'm not naming companies, but there's large companies like Monsanto, for example, that want to sell their seeds and do not want to sell biofortified seeds. So even there's incentives that are misplaced, there's profit reasons, etc. So I believe that all of these strategies have strong points and weak points, and that really a combination of them can help move us in the right direction for both the global north and the global south.
Yeah, thank you. And if I may, also I would love to hear Shireen afterward, but just if I may comment a bit on that. So I think there's a huge variety of culturally acceptable, culturally appropriate plant-based meals throughout the world. It's actually the global north that has a lack of that historically. It's actually the global south that has these. That's why we are borrowing so heavily on Asian food, whether it's dal or even the whole classic amino acid complementary combination. Whether it's from the Middle East with wheat and chickpeas, or it's maize and beans in Latin America, or dal and rice in India. So I mean, we actually have to learn a lot from the global south on plant-based meals. I think there's something tricky here that we just have to be aware. I think that a lot of us, actually, well, except from Shireen, maybe with your origins, but many of us still have. There's still a strong there's a whole history of a lot of ideology actually coming from the global north, which is quite Eurocentric on the whole idea of animal foods, the role they have to play in our diets. I'm not talking about living 100% vegan, but the whole thing of being... we just have to challenge ourselves, I think, I guess, a bit, because there are... the whole word protein, historically, still in German, the word for protein is Eiweiß, egg white. So the whole word protein came from eggs because people thought at that time that it only came from, it was coming from the animal kingdom. So I just think we should be open to maybe to consider that. There was something you said before that I'll challenge you a bit now here. Like you said, some people are consuming way too few animal foods. But we might say it this way, animal foods are like a multivitamin pill because they have a bit of everything in it, but also means like they're needed in a broken food system. If you have access to a wide variety of plant foods, then animal foods need to play less of a role in your diet. The problem is there's not access to a variety of plant foods for a lot of people in the global south. So this, I think, is a matter of inequality, of poverty, possibly also of education, also of entrenched interests. We will still see in the global south, we have companies from the global north, including Arla from Denmark, who are happily promoting dairy farms in Nigeria. And when I talked to a think tank in Nigeria recently, they said, this is just for the middle class. They want to sell dairy to the middle class. They don't really care about poverty or hunger. So I just think we should be... FAO has made this calculation saying like there are 4 billion people who have to change their diets in one direction, 3 billion people have to change in another direction, and 1 billion in a third direction. The 4 billion obviously are those who have to eat much less animal foods. The 1 billion are those I think you're primarily concerned about, and I agree with that. So in my view, help that 1 billion people get more animal foods if that is what can help them in the short term. But the 3 billion in the middle, I think, is an important question, because I don't think those 3 billion people need more animal foods, but many people will interpret this as if those 3 billion people also need more animal foods, and the planet can't hold that. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Can I come back to that, or we?
Yeah, sure. You're in the
Okay,
yeah.
That's definitely a very good point. I agree that there's a grayish, let's say, middle ground between those 4 billion and the 1 billion. And I agree that our food system is broken and cannot provide a variety and diversity of foods that might perhaps, let's say, act as a substitute for animal source foods. However, it is also true that there's bioavailability differences in nutrients, in plant source foods and animal source foods. And unfortunately, there's also an issue of people being aware of that and being aware of the importance of, for example, combining food in certain ways. I don't know, a very stupid example, but eating spinach together with lemon, which increases the bioavailability of iron. This is something that perhaps all of us in this room know, but that communities and tribes in Brazil or in Tanzania or in India do not know. And some of them might from their grandparents and knowledge that is transferred from generation to generation, but many will not. So there's also an issue there of like communicating how to eat, what to eat, how to combine foods into meals and diets, rather than just looking at individual foods, but rather looking at their combinations. I fully agree on that. And the fact that the food system cannot provide that at an affordable price, meaning that many people are left out, and many people have diets that are primarily based on starchy staples, which, as we've seen, are going down in nutrient density. So that's definitely a very important point. But there's also, I think, a large proportion, 1 billion or more or less, that number, that would greatly benefit from eating a bit more animal source foods to fill their nutrient gaps, especially given that fortification is not widely available, and if it is not compliant with standards. Supplements are expensive in many countries, not many people can afford them, or if they are affordable and available, then they actually may not be compliant with standards as well. So I think there's a lot of nuance to the discussion that gets lost, and all of these things can play a role.
Thanks very much. Any other questions from the audience? I think there were some people over here that have had their hands up for quite a long time. I actually think you had your hands up for quite a long time. No. Okay.
Thanks. So I'm Heather. I work at the Wellcome Trust. So as a research funder, this is kind of the context of my question. I feel like we're asking researchers increasingly to operate in funding landscapes that are clearly much more competitive, and increasingly public funding as well, and maybe other sources of funding is asking researchers to work with, in transdisciplinary ways, with other stakeholders like the food industry. So I used to work at UKRI, and increasingly you're required to work with an industry partner, and I guess that's because, you know, then you can show kind of commercialization and growth, et cetera, so the economic side of things. And I'm wondering, what is the role of industry in kind of working with researchers from your perspective, or in helping to kind of shift? Do we need to work with industry in these food systems transitions? And if so, how do we do that, given the power kind of context? And also, is there a role of research in bringing to light better the sort of power, political economy sides of things?
Shall I kick this off? So I love that question. And one of the things I probably should have said in the talk is that the conflicted institutions I referenced, and there are many more, are doing business as normal and something that's encouraged for quite good reasons. I think there's a really big difference between, for example, a sugar-sweetened beverage company funding research on the health effects of sugar-sweetened beverages, where there is a clear conflict. That research should not be funded in that way, and it shouldn't be published. I think it has no validity. But there are lots of food companies where there is not a conflict of interest. So I think, Runa, you were talking about plenty of plant companies funding novel ways of growing plants, and it's in that would be in everyone's interest. I think overall in the health landscape, the heuristic should really be most of the corporations we're talking about make money from excessive consumption of food, and most of them make products that are harmful. And so there are plenty of funding models where you can, we could tax them more, put that money in a pot. Tax is very complicated because that is passed on to consumers, but they already do research funding, so you can put it in a pot and dislocate it from the company, or use institutions like Wellcome, MRC, UKRI to separate it from the company. But I think the conflicts are a huge issue, and part of it is because of the power dynamics they create and legitimize.
Just a tiny thing I didn't make clear from the Danish plant-based food grant is actually encouraging healthier versions of processed food. So like a heavily ultra-processed, really unhealthy food would probably not get any of the Danish government funding. There's an emphasis on trying to encourage companies to that. And I think that's where public funding is important, or philanthropic funding. Because the companies themselves might choose easier solutions. But if enough public funding is there and is targeting convenience foods that have more healthy compositions, fermentation, for example, based, that would be really great, I think.
Great. Other questions?
I've got a question and then a follow-up to something that I was going to discuss. So the first one was with Chris' talk. You talked about saturated fat, sugar and salt, but you didn't bring up the reduction in fibre in ultra-processed foods, which also notoriously started to drop more and more over the last 20 years. So they've clearly found a reason to take fibre out, even though we know in most plant-based diets that's one of the beneficial things, certainly, with no conflict of interest with my research area. The other side I was going to come to was more of a cultural side of things that we haven't discussed, but I thought was good, coming from working with diverse groups, with the way in which food is passed down through generation. Maybe, for example, like cultural diversity in somewhere like India, where actually you're saying like adding something like high in vitamin C helps to absorb iron. These are things that are passed down between family and family, but these are good things that are happening, regardless that they maybe not understand the concepts behind actually the food process. What's happening certainly in the UK, and we could say also in the global north, that we're now passing down bad habits, like, for example, when your children do well, going to McDonald's, but actually in other populations, they maybe have something that's nutritionally better as a celebratory meal. So actually, culturally, we're switching to move towards ultra-processors actually as a theory to actually reward. And actually, if you think of the way in which children develop, that actually we're leading to actually forcing them back to the ultra-processed, regardless if the industry is causing that to happen.
I love those points.
Loves those points. Yeah.
Very briefly, I mean, you're totally right about fibre. I would suggest that if any single product, ultra-processed product or industrially processed, each product has thousands of properties, from the perfume, the logo, the font, the monkey on the pack, all the way through to the nutrient composition and the micronutrient composition. Each one has been optimized to either drive consumption or reduce the cost of production or sustain shelf life. And almost none of it is done for the benefit of the consumer. But yeah, no, very excellent point.
Thanks. I've got one question online here for Shireen. Given the strong data on benefits for normalising plant-rich diets to NHS and benefits on cutting climate impacts, how can the NHS / government justify not moving forward on this? And a second part question to Chris. Chris, could you use your position and knowledge to highlight the fact that hospitals continue to serve unhealthy processed meat? So a two-parter there.
Yes, endorse that, Chris. Please, can you get rid of processed meat from all hospitals in the NHS immediately? I think it's yes, no, but you will if you made a fuss on TV on BBC and said it's pretty hideous to walk into my canteen at King's College Hospital. I've said it now. That it's very bad, and we've tried to remove it, and it doesn't make financial doesn't tick all the financial boxes for the catering company. I think the science is clear. We need action. I think NHS trusts can independently decide to take this action because they have, as foundation trusts, can make those decisions. But I think we've seen the stresses under which the NHS is working under, and food just comes very low down, along with the fact that there isn't sufficient numbers of nutrition professionals working within the NHS at the moment to sort of support that knowledge transfer. We're just about to come up to another junior doctor strike. We've got waiting lists coming out of our ears. I think it's just deprioritised, and it's very difficult when you're always on, sort of goal command, on alert system with heat waves and all the rest, that it just doesn't get the priority it needs, even though it seems such common sense to address underlying drivers of chronic ill health as the first and foremost thing a health system does. So it's difficult.
Wonderful. I think we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but please collar all of the speakers after the talk and ask your questions then. Could we just thank everyone for their wonderful presentations?